Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. If you're watching this live on YouTube or on the podcast, it is Thanksgiving Day, and I hope that you had an amazing Thanksgiving Day that's more than just the turkey that you ate and the great food. It's more than just the family and friends and community that's being built. I pray that today was a day of genuine thanksgiving before the Lord. I'll remind you, as we said on Sunday, that you enter God's gates with thanksgiving, and gates represent the outer edges of a kingdom or the outer edges of an area of ownership. And so as you come into God's presence, you come in with thanksgiving, and I would argue that you remain with thanksgiving the entire time. And on that Thanksgiving Day subject, we want to be able to bring to you a podcast that first aired 3 years ago. This is a replay, but this is one you are going to want to hear because we have Dr. Tracey McKenzie going to be on with us today. And Tracey McKenzie is an expert on pilgrims and the first Thanksgiving. He's written some great material on it, a great book that I read on that subject, and he is just an outstanding person to be able to learn from. And so if you want to know what were they really eating in that first Thanksgiving, what was going through their minds, what were they thinking about, what did the world look like, why did these pilgrims come to America, we are going to answer all of those questions today on this re-aired podcast. So take a moment, gather your family around. This is a great moment for your kids to learn about Thanksgiving as well, and gather around and check this out. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you have an amazing and happy Thanksgiving. Hey everybody, welcome back to Creating the Future and this very special Thanksgiving conversation today that I get to have with Dr. Tracey McKenzie from Wheaton College. And welcome to the show, Dr. McKenzie.
It is my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
I can't lie, I have been anticipating this show because I am a history buff, by no means an expert, but I just love hearing the stories. I think a lot of men are kind of wired that way. I know a lot of people listening are wired that way, and we just love to hear all of the incredible stories from history and heroics and such. All right, so let's jump into this conversation about Thanksgiving. So you're kind of an expert on Thanksgiving, and so I want to start here because reading the intro to your book. It sounds like the first Thanksgiving was not in 1621. It sounds like there were some other Thanksgivings even before that.
That's exactly right. We remember this event that occurs in the fall of 1621. We call it the first Thanksgiving, or we have at least for a couple of centuries. Mm-hmm. There's actually all kinds of evidence that there were gatherings long before that in different scattered areas around the sort of the eastern half of North America. If you ask a Texan, he'll tell you that there were celebrations maybe 30, 40 years before the Pilgrims. Florida claims an early celebration near Jacksonville. State of Maine claims an early celebration. So we always have to think of that title as a little bit figurative. It's not literally the case, but it is one that we remember in part because of the records that survive and how that began to be very important in the way we think of our early history.
Yeah. And when you're dealing with Christian people, then they should be full of thanksgiving and gratitude anyway. So certainly there were many other Thanksgivings before the Thanksgiving, so to speak, that we refer to that I guess really kind of became the foundation to the holiday that we celebrate this week. So let's just jump into, tell us the story of the first Thanksgiving, these pilgrims, coming over to the New World, in your vantage point, tell us that story.
Yeah. So, I think some of the contours of that story are probably pretty familiar to us. We remember that there was this group of pretty humble men and women, not particularly wealthy or influential, who migrate to present-day Massachusetts in 1620. They actually don't come from England directly. Sometimes we forget that detail. Okay. Many of them had migrated from England to Holland around 1607 or so. And so many of the passengers of the Mayflower had actually been in a Dutch city called Leiden for more than a decade. And so they're coming to North America from Holland, arriving in November of 1620, so almost exactly 4 centuries ago.
Okay.
They're going to sort of explore the coast for a period of several weeks, looking for a good settling place. And they finally determined that this area around present-day Plymouth is an attractive site, and it's on the 22nd of December in 1620 that they come on shore. They've actually survived the journey pretty amazingly intact. There was really only one fatality along the way out of 102 passengers. But it's those months that follow that are just devastating. And a lot of this, we think, is just because the harbor is very shallow at Plymouth, and they couldn't dock near land. So they actually are dropping their anchor maybe half mile from shore. Their longboat has been damaged badly on the voyage, so they don't have any way to get ashore other than to wade through the water. Okay. So they're wading through waist-high water, a half a mile to and from over the span of months while they're working on developing a settlement. Yeah. And so they start to die of exposure and pneumonia. And before all is said and done, 52 of the 102 passengers will die in that first winter. Almost every family is affected. Right. There are 18 married couples on board, and only 3 of those couples survive intact. Mm-hmm. So an enormous death. They do half make it through. They have a decent harvest, and so what we remember as that first Thanksgiving is their celebration of that harvest after this incredibly costly, arduous, painful winter that they had endured.
Yeah, so Thanksgiving now is November, but they came in November. How soon was the original first Thanksgiving?
So what we remember then is a year after that. So, they're going to arrive in November, but they first actually touched ground at present-day Cape Cod, and they're spending at least 6 weeks looking for a place to settle. So they settled just before Christmas in 1620. Okay. Then we talk about that really hard winter, the agricultural season to follow. And so
hard time to come. Yeah.
So we don't know exactly when it happened, but it would have been sometime in the fall of 1621.
Okay. So in the fall, so it wasn't too far from November, the present day that's celebrated.
Yeah, that's right. There's no historical reason to connect the celebration of our holiday today to late November. That's actually something that begins around the time of the American Civil War.
Right.
But the records that survive from the Pilgrims they don't tell us when it was.
Right. They weren't that concerned with the actual date. They didn't know we're going to be celebrating it, literally 400 years later, still talking about the story. They're just trying to survive. All right. So what's their relationship with the Native Americans at this time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a little bit hard to pin down. One of the things that we'd say right off the bat is that they're arriving at a time that the Native American population has been undergoing some dramatic kinds of changes. Mm-hmm. Okay. There had been European visitors for several years before this, and we believe that they introduced some diseases that have devastating effect on the various tribes.
Right.
So the Native American population had probably been reduced pretty significantly. Okay. And the people who were most near to Plymouth was a group called the Wampanoag, and it's pretty clear that they had been really badly affected by disease. And Plymouth itself was actually on the side of a Native American village of Indians called the Patuxet, and they had been completely wiped out. So that's the first thing. So it comes at a time when things are dramatically changing for the Native Americans. Their relationship with some of the Indian tribes is very adversarial. Mm-hmm. The relationship with their nearest neighbors, the Wampanoag, becomes pretty strong over time. Sometimes I say we can exaggerate just how comfortable that relationship was. I suspect it was always just a little bit tense, but it's clear that they found a way to get along, to help one another. Mm-hmm. And as our popular memory reminds us, the Wampanoag are present at that celebration in 1621, even bringing some of the menu when they showed up with 5 deer, which I'm sure would have been welcome.
Well, let's ask that big question here. So we have a very traditional Thanksgiving menu now of, turkey and gravy and all the different things. Now, what were they eating at that first Thanksgiving?
Yeah, this is the question I always sort of hate to get because the answer tends to disappoint us just a little bit. Almost nothing that we consider sort of traditional Thanksgiving fare would have been something that they would have expected to eat. And it really starts with turkey. The governor of the colony, a man named William Bradford, he talks about lots of turkeys, wild turkeys in the area, but they also describe them as incredibly fast birds, really fast.
Right.
And the kinds of weapons that the Pilgrims had at the time, the guns in particular they had were very heavy.
Yeah.
They were as tall as the Pilgrims were. They
Yeah.
would have been fired with a tripod. So it's
Right.
not so basically they weren't gunning down these fast moving
Right.
turkeys. What Bradford says is that they had all kinds of waterfowl. So if you go to Plymouth today, there are all these little ponds and rivers that flow into the bay.
Yeah.
And so we can imagine just these enormous flocks of geese and pigeons and ducks that are descending on the area. And so they're probably firing from a blind and shooting all kinds of waterfowl. Then beyond that, they would have had Indian corn. The Pilgrims themselves were fond of what they called salad herbs, which was various vegetables that they would grow in their gardens, like turnips and cabbage and parsnips. They actually enjoyed eel. One of the things that William Bradford describes is how the Indian, who we remember as Squanto, taught the Pilgrims how to get eels out of the creek and river beds. And he actually dug them out of the mud with his feet. And so, so they probably
early version of noodling.
Yeah, it's not what we would expect to have today. But so lots of ducks and geese, lots of vegetables, no pumpkin pie.
Yeah.
They didn't have ovens as of 1621. They probably wouldn't have had cranberry sauce because they didn't have sugar. And eating just straight cranberries probably wasn't super appetizing. So sweet potatoes was not indigenous to that area. So, most of those things we think of just weren't on the menu.
Yeah. So it's a celebration of survival now at this point, because you've been there for essentially a year or close to it since they've landed. Their relationship with the natives seems to be back and forth. How do they communicate with the natives? Who is this Squanto character? I remember the name from grade school, like a lot of us, but refresh our memories.
Yeah, that's right. So, they do settle then in December, and for several months they don't communicate. They know they see glimpses of Native Americans, from a distance. But they're not communicating. And then it appears probably around March, just totally to their amazement, this Native American man walks into their village and he says, "Welcome." And it's actually another member of the Wampanoag who had some familiarity with English. But he introduces the Pilgrims to this man. His real name was Tisquantum. It's shortened to Squanto. And Squanto had been a member of this Patuxet tribe that had lived on the site of Plymouth originally. He actually, it's an amazing story. He actually had been kidnapped by English sailors probably 5 to 10 years earlier. He had been taken to Spain. He'd actually been liberated in Spain by Catholic priests. He's made his way to England, where he learns English very well. And he returns hoping to reunite with his tribe when he has the opportunity to go with the English ship and finds out that none of his tribe is alive anymore.
Yeah.
But so he hooks up with the Wampanoag, and what the Pilgrims then find is this man who lived several years in England, who had very proficient English, and he serves as a kind of sort of constant translator between the two groups.
So so if you're on the Mayflower, if you're a Pilgrim, as I understand it, and you can speak into this too, they're fleeing for religious freedom, trying to find religious freedom. It's got to look like the sovereignty of God that you land and find the lone Native American that happens to speak English that helps to, create a unity there and working together between the tribes. How did they look at it? Is that their background, I guess, first of all, and how did they look at it?
Yeah. So you've mentioned a couple of things. So let's take them in turn.
Okay.
The first really is, why were they coming? And that's actually a question that, to be very honest, I think is often misunderstood.
Okay.
The Pilgrims absolutely had left England for Holland because they were under conviction that the Church of England, which was the established church at the time, was engaging in practices that were not scriptural.
Okay.
And ultimately, they concluded they actually could not in good conscience be part of those congregations.
Okay.
But to use that term, to separate from that established church was against the law in England. And so they ultimately are forced to leave the country. When they go to Holland, though, they find a country that is, for its day, quite diverse and quite religiously tolerant. And so the Pilgrim writers who described their time there actually say their church was, in some respects, flourishing, that they experienced a great deal of religious liberty to organize their worship as they thought the Bible required of them. What they don't have in Holland, well, there are several things they don't have in Holland. Yeah. They don't have much economic opportunity. They're working primarily as weavers in the textile industry there. They're probably working, every member of the family, 6 days a week from dawn to dusk.
Yeah.
And William Bradford just says, it's making them old before their time. It's just an arduous existence. They also aren't super happy with Dutch culture. Their Dutch neighbors are telling them that they're too strict in the way that they raise their children. Yeah. Their Dutch neighbors don't recognize and observe the Sabbath the way the Pilgrims think is appropriate. And so they're worried. They're worried about the influence of the culture on their families. Mm-hmm. They're worried about their economic future. They're seeing some members of their congregation actually return to England because they're so discouraged by what's the situation there. So that's what leads actually to their decision to migrate. And one of the things that I so appreciate that we can actually lose sight of, maybe it's just so obvious, but I think we often don't acknowledge it, is that they want to keep their church together. Today, if someone loses a job in our congregation, you'll look for a job somewhere else. And if it means leaving your church to join a different one, you do that. Right. They don't want to see that happen. They don't want their congregation to gradually sort of fall apart. And so they're looking for a solution that the entire church would be involved in, that they will, as a body, relocate, hopefully to a place where these challenges aren't so severe. Yeah. But to get to your other question, how do they see, what they encounter? First thing that we would say about the Pilgrims is they absolutely believe everything is an expression of God's sovereignty. Okay. God is actively involved in the most minute details of their lives. And so when they encounter this man, Squanto, who to their amazement knows English, William Bradford immediately will write, this is a gift of God for our good. Yeah. And so he has, no doubt that this is, a problem.
And I suppose it's hard to argue against that, right? I mean, if you land there and you find a guy speaking English, what's the chances of that? That's got to be astronomically low. Yeah. What was their religious background? Are they more Puritan? What was their?
So the Pilgrims are a kind of subset of Puritans. So when we talk about Puritans, we're just referring to any English Protestants who believed that the Church of England had made too many compromises. Now, the Church of England had broken with the Catholic Church in the 1530s, but a lot of English Protestants believed that there was still a lot of Catholic influence. The hierarchy of church officials, the priest, bishop, cardinal, not pope, but a pope-like figure. They said this is not scriptural. They were concerned about the use of the Book of Common Prayer, which basically prescribes set liturgy for every worship time. They said that's not really biblical. So the Puritans all wanted to, quote, purify the Church of England of these remnants. The Pilgrims, probably the best way to think of them is that they're really more radical, and I don't mean this in a negative sense, but they're more radical Puritans. That they have come to the conclusion that purifying the Church of England from within the church is not likely going to happen. Yeah. And so they are literally withdrawing or separating themselves from the established church.
Yeah. Well, it almost seemed like by today's standards, if a whole church suddenly moved to another country, we would say that's cult-like, right? There's almost this following that says we're going to be our own way, and everybody's going to follow us in that. Yeah. And their rules, wasn't it Bradford who also said if you don't work, you don't eat? Is that right, or am I wrong about that?
Well, yes. There's a particular story probably that you might be thinking of, which I think is really humorous. Not long after what we remember as the first Thanksgiving in the fall of 1621, there's a ship that arrives to provide more settlers for the colony, But a number of these have been recruited by some of the merchants who are financing the venture. They're not part of the congregation originally from Holland. And so these are all single men, and if they may not have been Christian at all. If they were Christian, they probably had very different standards of behavior. And on Christmas Day, when the Pilgrims were all out working, because actually the Pilgrims did not celebrate Christmas. I can explain that if you wish, but they did not celebrate Christmas. They go out to work, but all these new men say, our conscience says we ought not to be working on Christmas. We need to, stay at home. So he says, okay. And so they go out to work in the morning. They come home at lunchtime, and all these new male settlers are out in the streets playing a game. And Bradford says, okay, if your conscience says you can't work on this day, I'm going to allow that. But my conscience says it's not good for me to be working while you're playing. And so you need to just sit in your houses if you're not going to work with us. And I think that's a fun story.
That is kind of funny. Were they 6 days a week work at that period?
Yes.
And then a Sabbath, which okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Very, very funny. Well, what's the quick version? Because now you whet our appetite and our interest. What's the quick version for why they didn't celebrate Christmas?
For Christmas, yeah. So the Pilgrims are really strict in the way that they think about holy days. They basically say if the Bible has not commanded us to observe a holy day, a holiday, then we don't have the freedom to create one. Right. And so they would just say, show me in the Bible where it says what day was Jesus' birthday, and show me in the Bible where we're commanded to celebrate it, and we'll do that.
Right.
But they didn't see that. So they actually thought they associated it with Catholicism more than anything else.
Okay. So another thing reminds me from grade school, my mind's going back to the Mayflower Compact. Right. Wasn't that the governmental kind of structure as they got here for themselves, of how to government themselves, take care of themselves? Explain that real quick for us.
Yeah. So it's one of those sort of significant moments that we tend to recall.
Right.
In the first one, really. So they arrive in, as I've said, off the coast of New England in November of 1620. They had procured permission to land in an area that was being settled by a company that had been chartered by the British Crown. And so they were going to settle under the umbrella of the authority of this royally chartered company. But they actually end up, because of some storms that they encounter along the way, they end up at least 200 miles farther north in the northernmost stretch of land under the charter of this company. Mm-hmm. And so if you want to think of it this way, they believed that they would be settling in an area where there was really sort of no legal government in place. And so they do, before they decide to choose any place to settle, they call all of the male adults into one of the, I think it's the captain's cabin, and they sign a kind of document. It's fairly brief. It's just one paragraph, really. And it basically says that they're going to form themselves into what they would have called a body politic, and that they were going to submit to one another and to whatever rules and leaders they would identify. They did see that, I think it's important to note, as a kind of temporary thing. They weren't sort of declaring their independence from the king. They did believe that they were in a situation where something like this was essential. For at least the immediate future. Yeah.
All right. So if we were to go to most homes in the United States of America today, there's traditional things that go on. We've already talked about food. That's going to be followed by football of some sort, whether in the backyard or watching the Lions get beat or whatever it is there on television, and, and vegging out, everybody's falling asleep after all that, all the turkey and such. All right, so what if we were there on the first Thanksgiving? What's going on around us? What games are they playing? What are they talking about? What's going on?
Yeah, so if we were there, a few observations. First thing I would say is that it wouldn't look anything like our gatherings. Yeah. It's very doubtful. You may have seen pictures, artist renderings that were done, say, in the 19th century. We often envision the Pilgrims around this very long table, and
it always looks like a church potluck.
It does. It looks a lot like in the fellowship hall, as we would call it. But they have almost no furniture at the time. It's almost certain that they would have been seated on the ground. They're not eating with utensils very much. They would have had knives. They do not have forks in the early 17th century. Forks had been invented, yes, but they were not widely in use, and they were really associated with the ultra wealthy. It was a sign of pretension if you used a fork. And so most common folks would have had spoons for soup, and everything else is knife or hands. So first of all, I imagine the Pilgrims sitting on the ground, outdoors, eating with their hands. It's more like a 4th of July kind of feel than what we think of as Thanksgiving. They are probably playing games. The one thing that William Bradford, who writes most about this, says is that they were engaging in kind of military exercises. So there may have been some drill, there may have been some shooting contest, perhaps. We just sort of have to speculate. But that's the feel of it, at least. And so imagine sitting on the ground, eating with your hands, having eel and turnips, and you're being an authentic Thanksgiving celebrator.
You can bust our bubble. So I'm going to throw this out. I've heard this said, you're the historian, that the phrase turkey shoot comes from those early Thanksgivings and those kind of things where you would tie a turkey to a tree. The guys who might have already had a little bit too much to drink or what have you, with guns that weren't terribly accurate, shooting at the turkey to see who could shoot the turkey first. Is that true?
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to have to plead my ignorance. I can't provide a positive answer to that. Yeah.
All right. If you were going to just mess us up and mess up our, 21st century Thanksgiving minds, is there anything else that you haven't said that you would say, wow, this really is nothing like it is today?
Well, so here's something. I don't know if this is exactly fitting your category, but something I'd really like to share. And this can burst our bubbles or challenge us. Yeah. The Pilgrims would not have called that celebration a Thanksgiving. And I do want to just share really quickly what they would have meant by that.
Yeah.
They believed that God had designated in his scripture one clear holy day, that was specified in specific time frames, and that was the Sabbath.
Okay.
And so that's God's holy day. It's commanded, and they were strict observers of the Sabbath. Then they said that the scripture authorized what they would have called occasional holy days, and they looked primarily to the Old Testament and said that there were times when the children of Israel would celebrate days, what they called, or observe days of humiliation and fasting, or of thanksgiving. And so when circumstances occurred where they feared that they were under the judgment of God or dealing with some sort of serious adversity, they would set aside an entire day for prayer, for fasting. They would gather together corporately, and they would pray for God's deliverance. Similarly, if they saw that there was some, just sort of out of the usual provision of God's mercy that delivered them from a trial, then they would set aside a day, and it would be a very solemn day. It would involve lots of prayer and corporate worship, a day of Thanksgiving.
Okay.
And so they certainly were celebrating God's goodness in that fall celebration, but they didn't call it a day of Thanksgiving. The first day of Thanksgiving, according to the history of Plymouth Plantation, occurred in 1623, and it's a wonderful story. It's in the summer. They already know that their food supplies are short, so they're banking everything on another good harvest in the fall.
Yeah.
And then in late spring, a drought sets in. And for 2 months, according to William Bradford, they don't have any rain. And their corn is just dying on the stalk. They're looking starvation full in the face. And so they call for a day of humiliation and fasting.
Yeah.
And according to another Pilgrim writer, they spend the entire day in prayer in their meeting house. And they say that a day that began with a cloudless sky ends with overcast. In the following morning, a gentle rain begins to fall that lasts for 14 days.
Wow.
And the crops that were dying are rejuvenated just almost literally before their eyes.
Yeah.
And so this writer says, if we sought in prayer and humiliation God's deliverance publicly, we weren't going to retire privately to our prayer closets and thank him for his deliverance. We're going to gather together and observe a day of Thanksgiving. So what they would have thought was their first Thanksgiving was later in the summer of 1623, where they were thanking God for that rain that delivered them from the drought and probably saved the colony.
Wow, what a great story. So that's the real Thanksgiving right there.
Yeah, that's what I would say. And of course, I think it's great. I love the Thanksgiving, traditions that we have. Yeah. But I've often thought, I didn't study this when my children were small, but I've often thought, if I knew about this, I would love as a father to be looking for opportunities to say, today we're gonna either get together and pray for God's mercy to take us through some trial. But when I saw God's kindness, I would love to tell my kids, no school today. So we homeschool. I'd love to say, no school today. Today's a day of celebration. It's not something that's on the calendar, but it's our open acknowledgement of God's kindness and our joyful response to it.
That's so good. That's so good. So the 1621 Thanksgiving, would they have also have had some sort of church services or prayer gatherings?
No, that's one of the reasons why we say they would not have considered it a Thanksgiving. It was just it was a party, and
so they didn't consider
have a good time.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. Well, that might answer the next question that I had, and this is one that I feel like we struggle with this in the modern American world of, is it Thanksgiving for something or to someone, right? Is it Thanksgiving for the blessings or is it Thanksgiving to the blesser? And I think in America, as we become a little bit more secular in our way of thinking, it quickly becomes, I'm thankful for this thing. I'm thankful for my car. I'm thankful for my wife. It seems to me, and I'd love your take on this, that we lose something with that when we're not going who we're thankful to. We're thankful to God for these things. And so it's a both and, not an either or. What's your thought on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of what they understood as genuine Thanksgiving holy day, I think they would have said, you can't separate the two. You know, that you designate a day for Thanksgiving because you have seen God's miraculous provision in some way. So there's something specific that you are thankful for, and you have no doubt in your mind whatsoever to whom you are thankful for that. Mm-hmm. So I think one sort of fits hand in hand with the other. They certainly would not have wanted to separate the giver from the gift. That just wouldn't, I don't think it would have made sense to them.
Right. Yeah, the way we do today. All right, then my last question. So, you have 52 that survive in 1621, if I got that number right. And of those 52, what happens to them? We all know Thanksgiving stories, and then most of our history classes just kind of jump to something else. So what happens to these 52? Where do they?
Yeah, that's a great question. I joke and say that we lose interest with them after the turkey is carved. It's so our story does sort of end with that harvest celebration. So the colony grows slowly. Even a half century in, it still has a population maybe of only 300 or so. And eventually it is absorbed into what today we know as the state of Massachusetts.
Right.
And so it ceases to have that sort of independent existence. Yeah. So the time that the Pilgrims are sort of on the stage is fairly short.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So if somebody wants to get your book, The First Thanksgiving, The Real Story, what the real story tells us about loving God and learning from history, what's the best way to do that?
Easiest thing is just go through Amazon. You'll find it very, very easily there. And I just would say it makes wonderful gifts. So if you want to give it to a bunch of people, just feel free.
Listen, I know you are absolutely enjoying this conversation with Dr. McKenzie, and I highly recommend the book. Go on Amazon right now, pause the podcast, whatever. Go on your Amazon app, go buy the book right now. But you also have a blog that you consistently write on with different history.
Well, and I have a blog called Faith in American History, and I think of it right now, I'm taking a little bit of a sabbatical from it. But anyone who is interested in sort of thinking Christianly about American history and faith-informed commentary on different episodes of American history, I think it's a good resource. There are about 300 essays on the blog, all are designed to stand alone. So you can sort of go to the index and pick out a topic that interests you and read, I hope, edifying essays.
For any homeschooling parents, I know your books are a little bit more academic. They're InterVarsity Press for the most part, which are going to be kind of academic books. Maybe a high school senior or somebody might be able to lean into that. But what about your blogs? Are they something that parents could use as teaching aids within homeschooling?
I wish they were, and that would be a wonderful thing. They're really meant for more mature readers. I mean, again, as you said, maybe a high school student, but it's probably more for the parents.
Yeah.
I'll just say really fast. I think an introduction just to what it means to think as a Christian about history is a different book that I've written called A Little Book for New Historians. Okay. And it's also through IVP, and you can get that on Amazon. And it's very short. It's about 70 pages long. It's meant to be very accessible. And I would hope that it would be a resource for Christian educators.
Yeah, that would be great. And it's always the first priority of the parent is to teach, not to hand it off to other teachers. So I encourage parents to get the book and read it. And, then you chew it up and give it down to the kids at their level, and teach them that way. So listen, it has been such a privilege talking to you. I hope everybody has enjoyed this as much as I have. Make sure you get the books. We will put his book, his blog, actually all of his books. We'll put them in the show notes, and so you can link to you can find the links to them there. And look forward to having you back on the show at another time.
It was absolutely my pleasure, and happy Thanksgiving to you and all your congregation and listeners.
Thank you.